The largest occupation of modern history is effective and keeps an entire people captive, denies its identity, its land and resources, and condemns them to death. Israel is occupying Cisjordan, East Jerusalem, Gaza, to historic Palestine to impose the Great Israel. More than once, international organizations and governments have asked the end to oppression without a result. In spite of this systematic colonial violence, the Palestinian people are still struggling for what they consider theirs. After several days of attacks and counterattacks in the most unfair conditions, this week there was a political move. We act victory for the oppressed. First Minister Netanyahu, in a large-scale offensive and a truce, chose a truce, knowing that the cost will not be zero. The first great political effect has been the resignation of one of the hawks of governments that believes that they must bury all Palestinians. What is this truce about? What did Netanyahu put on the balance? Will this start pausing resistance? This is our critical move today. Last Tuesday, First Minister Netanyahu decided not to make a big military offensive against the Hamas in the Gaza Strip, with more than 460 projectiles that, in its turn, was the response of one of many operations of Israel that killed 14 Palestinians and thousands of wounds. He started a mediation with Egypt, but the Minister of Defense did not agree. That was talking about soft policies of Netanyahu, and even before taking office, appeared as a hard opponent of Hamas. He resigned because required advanced elections. This is the first effect of a political decision with different costs. We will analyze later regarding what Lieberman resigned in a press conference. Yesterday's truce, together with the agreement with Hamas, is a submission to terror. There is no other way of defining it or no other meaning but a submission to terror. What we are doing as a country is buying short-term calm that in the future will damage national security. Palestinian movement Hamas and the people living in the Gaza Strip immediately considered this resignation as a political triumph of Palestine and admission of failure of Lieberman in his purpose of finishing this people, as he has expressed in more than one occasion. Lieberman's resignation is due to the inability of challenging the resistors in the Gaza Strip. This is a great political victory in resistance versus these arrogant and extremist people. This is due to resistance. What Hamas and the resistance of our people want is the end of occupation and not only the end of political life. Since March, tens of thousands of unarmed Palestinians in their own territory have been wounded in the Gaza Strip. Hundreds died, including children, women, physicians, and journalists. Hundreds of members have been amputated. But let's go to the geographic location where these atrocities occur and the chronology of the last attacks until this truce that ended in Lieberman's resignation. The Gaza Strip, after the UN partition plan in 1947, is a closed strip located southeast of Israel and the west of the Sinai border. Together with Cisjordan, they are called Palestinian territories. 11 kilometers border with Egypt, 51 kilometers border with Israel, 40 kilometers of coast, Mediterranean coast. Since 2007, the territorial control is conducted by Hamas. Together with Cisjordan, East Jerusalem, and the heights of Golan is considered occupied territory by Israel since 1967 that subjects all the population living there to a military blockade that prevents the arrival of medicines, food, construction. The reiterated after the last military scaled in 2014, 2018 aggressions have been a constant. On November 11, 7 members of Hamas and 1 lieutenant of Israel died in an attack in south of Gaza. On November 12, Hamas reported this fact and responded by launching 460 rockets and mortar projectiles against the south of Israel, killing 1 Palestinian. Finally, on November 13, Israeli authorities chose a non-written truce requested by Hamas through 4 mediators from Qatar, Norway, Egypt, and the United Nations. Even so, on November 14, Israeli authority crossed cross, also known as Bitanum, to prevent Gaza transit to Israel, even for humanitarian cases. It is under complete Israeli control, is the only cross between Israel, the Strip, and occupied Cisjordan. We are reading what Rebellion or PalestinaLibre.org publishes today. Palestinians celebrate their independence. Territories controlled by National Palestinian Authority with closed schools and hospitals. Palestinian people remember on November 15, 1998, when then President of Palestinian Yasser Arafat was proclaimed president with Jerusalem East as capital, which meant Israel's acknowledgement that it did not have international recognition. Palestinian leaders supported 2 states and resolutions of the United Nations and their firm commitment with inalienable rights of Palestinian people. This was reported by Hannah Masraoui, member of the Executive Committee of LPO. This is an aggression that started with Nakba in 1948, when the State of Israel was established in part of the British Mandate of Palestine, with the partition resolution passed by United Nations. This we read from Palestinian webpage. Now we go to Hispan TV, an article written by a Chilean author, expert in Latin American, and the title is Lieberman Wants the Zionist Crown. The accusations of having accepted bribes and performing frauds and abuse of confidence will have a hard counteractor after Lieberman resigned. Israel and movements do not see the negotiations with Palestine with good eyes, and the most visible expression was the barricades lifted by demanding ceasefire. Lieberman would take advantage of this point, the unhappiness with Netanyahu, and will increase the fearing atmosphere. An abstract that gives us another key element for us to analyze and consult our guests. Resignation that is still news. Our correspondent Nayara Tardo will update the move performed. Is it the end of Lieberman's political life? Greetings for you and our viewers. Well, the resignation of Lieberman as Minister of Defense of Israel still is news in this region. This resignation was used by Lieberman to justify the ceasefire between Hamas and Israel, but that for many analysts in the region is the easiest way Lieberman found to come out clean out of the situation that he caused. Let's remember that the operations of Sunday were coordinated and conducted by Lieberman and caused this violence in the Gaza Strip. This operation was made to eliminate the high commander of Hamas that died during the confrontations that also killed 6 Palestinian militias and 1 Israeli commander. This attack did not come out as they expected, and the high military command questioned Lieberman and also questioned the Israeli army. What calls the attention with this resignation is Lieberman's recons to advance elections. This has made everyone ask themselves if Lieberman's figure would disappear from the authorities. Hamas is celebrating Lieberman's resignation and sees it as a failure of the Israeli army, but insists that Palestinian resistance will continue in territories occupied by Israel. This alleged truce is seen by many analysts like frail and uncertain because the Israeli army assured that it will increase its presence in the Gaza Strip. And yesterday, Israeli forces murdered a Palestinian young man who was fishing in the Gaza Strip. Other Israeli ministers, together with Lieberman, to this truce, and they also object the coalition of Netanyahu that until now has not named a successor for Lieberman. These are some of the reactions of this resignation. Thank you, Nayara. Uncertain and frail truce. The Israeli government, if that petition or demand of advance elections made by Lieberman when he announced his resignation, will he become a candidate? Will he be a hard contender? And what does this mean considering what he said and the policies he applied when we exercised the Ministry of Defense? We also ask, can the Lieberman's resignation mean a cessation in the violence against Gaza that is claiming its historic territory? We'll be back with the answer after the pause. A truce was agreed even when there's nothing in writing between Palestine and Israel, and now this truce is such, said our correspondent, that it is called frail and uncertain. What is the truce considered with such violence on that occupied territory? On November 14, Al-Madajin says that Israeli police shoot a Palestinian on an alleged aggression. We here have the news that our correspondent was talking about. A young Palestinian man was a target of shots from Israel in an occupied strip. Residents of a town of Jabal said that they heard strong shots, while hundreds of officials and intelligence forces assaulted the town and blocked all their access and nearby streets. They also informed that armed men came out against a Zionist military control near Bisgud, built in the city of Alpirat. 60 years old, a discotheque worker and representative of the most conservative Israeli force, that is Victor Lieberman. Let's see his positions as a government official. Victor Lieberman was born in Moldavia. He migrated to Israel at 20 years old and immediately belonged to extreme nationalism sectors. He is a politician leader of Israel Beitenu that handles the dependence of disagreements with the Israeli policy. Besides the government coalition until a few days ago, and he has 5 seats in parliament. Lieberman has called the First Minister Netanyahu soft and talks too much with the Palestinian people. Minister of Foreign Affairs between 2009 and 2012 and 2012 and 13, and Ministry of Defense from 2016 to November 2018. He is accused of being part of the Quds Party, illegalized in 1998 for racist and anti-Arab positions. Lieberman defended bombarding Tehran and ending the war between Israel and Iran. He claimed to destroy everything. In October 2006, after being a Minister of Strategic Matters of Israel, his priority was the offensive against Iran. In 2003, Lieberman protected a government to expand Jewish land in Cisjordan and pass the Palestinian Authority from Wadi Ara region almost completely inhabited by Israel and now in the hands of Israel. Extremist and radical Zionist. In 2014, he said that the Arab Israel that aren't loyal to Israel must be decapitated with an ox. In his opinion, the Israeli citizen shall I think we have enough elements to add our guests. From Bilbao, Spain, Iñaki Restorasov, international analyst, and Jorge Cranes from Argentina, journalist, specialist in the Middle East, and director of pulsodelos.pueblos.com. I start with Iñaki. What do you think Netanyahu thought between a military offensive and a truce, knowing that this decision of the truce would bring some costs? Well, I assume that continued with the war would aggravate things. I think that Netanyahu has become aware that the Palestinian defense is important and has shown an important capacity of response. The fact that after this frustrated attempt of kidnapping a commander of the Qassam brigades of the radical area of Hamas that went wrong and became a murder, we don't know why they want to kidnap him for information or what, and the Palestinian answer has been very important, launching 450 missiles that have supported the Israel defense system that was unable to control that bombarding of missiles that launched in a short time and produced serious serious physical and moral damage. Physical damages against several towns near Gaza. There have been important impacts. 3 settlers died, tens of wounded people, etc. And of course, the answer they have had with bombardments in 100 points with tanks and others would aggravate even more things. And with the support of Hezbollah also. And I think that he saw a level of resistance of some importance. So escalate of war with Palestine could imply involving Lebanon, Hezbollah, and others. So I think he has chosen for reaching a series of ceasefire agreements with the mediation of Egypt and the United Nations. And even if the most right-wing sectors like Lieberman and others, they saying that this has been a clarification and some kind of surrender. I think that Netanyahu is willing. The fact that Avigdor Lieberman leave the party, these are 5 members of Congress, that still allows him a certain majority with 61 members of 120. In principle, Netanyahu has appeared as willing to assume the positions of Minister of Defense beside Foreign Affairs and Sanity. But there's another problem. Another sector, right-wing, has proposed that they also want to their leader, Naftali Bennett, fill the position instead of Lieberman. And if this were not made, they also threaten with leaving or stopping the support to Netanyahu, and this would lead the coalition, government coalition, be in minority in parliament, which would mean having to advance elections, in principle set for November 2019. Well, it is to see if this Ovar Judío group still remains in a critical position and unconditional, that if they don't put their leader, Naftali Bennett, in the position of Minister of Defense, they will stop supporting the government. If they don't, if not, they will, they don't comply with this, Netanyahu could still remain in office without calling elections. But if this Jewish Ovar continues with its accusations, there would have to be new elections. And what would happen then? I don't know. It's difficult to foresee. But in any case, it would be once again the right wing elected. I couldn't say the relation of forces with those new elections. In any case, I think that we must emphasize the great victory of the Palestinians in this process, and that the ceasefire negotiation has been a great victory of Palestinians, and they have celebrated, while the opponents, that is the settlers and right-wing parties, have criticized it and have been burning tires in the neighborhoods with demonstrations and others. This is a tense situation, and we'll see what happens. I would like to ask Jorge Creines from Buenos Aires, how do you see victory for Palestinian resistance? Will this mark changes in the Israeli policy? The fact that Lieberman left the government. Well, before everything, I've agreed to Caracas and Bilbao. I confirmed the analysis of my peer, and I've considered it an important victory of this Palestinian people that has increased resistance in the Gaza Strip in the last time, and Israeli attacks and the deaths they have caused, the wounded people, the weapons, and the attacks they've made have also been subject of a strong international rejection of all of those who want a world of peace with liberty and rights for all people. I think that this great victory not only has meant an encouragement for the Palestinian people for having an independent state, a struggle that has decades and has strong international support, but as explained, has also generated a strong crisis in the Israeli government, right-wing government with more extremists than others, but that was an alliance of First Minister Netanyahu with sectors that are more to the right. And now you will know what matters of international policy and internal international policy are playing a role, an important role in generating this crisis. Therefore, we must see how this process continues to see how the events, what events will take place. If the state crisis in Israel means advancing elections, this could aggravate the crisis in Israel. But it is clear that in these days there is a very important change in the policy with the resignation of Lieberman and the presence of the struggle of the Palestinian people that does not resignate in spite of so many aggressions. And it's probable that a great step has been taken to stop this genocide policy promoted by Lieberman and other sectors of the extreme right in Israel, a policy that evidently is rejected by the Palestinian people as well as the international community that has put the government of First Minister Netanyahu at risk. They're talking about Palestine and governmental crisis in Israel. You agree with my first guest. But what would happen with advanced elections if Lieberman decides to become a candidate to being First Minister? Whether advanced or not, what can we expect for Palestine? I think that on one hand, the Palestinian people have shown that they will continue with their struggle, and I think this is inevitable. They cannot determine the will of combat or their freedom. Regarding the Israeli citizens, I consider that it will depend on the forces more related to reasonability, with intelligence, not continue aggravating this conflict and find a solution, because the solution would be for the Palestinian people to be able to have an independent state. I will ask our other guest, Iñaki from Spain, what does this political move mean and the effects we are seeing? From the outside, what does it mean? Well, it's very interesting to see. I think that the international community, the Middle East countries, have seen that if there are important wars in other places, in Syria, for example, in Yemen, This victory of Palestine is a victory of the set of victories that are taking place against Israel in the Middle East and against the Western structure. So I think they still have many vindications pending in Palestine. The measures taken in the last times against the Palestinian people have been brutal. They are demanding since March 30th, each Friday, for the freedom of all exiles or their return. They are struggling for occupied land to return. They are demanding the capital of Palestine to be Jerusalem and not Israel, that Israel be Tel Aviv, and that they annul the law that pretends to, or that has turned Israel in Jewish state with a single religion. So there's a series of pending struggles that they are struggling every Friday, where there are constantly deaths and wounded people, but they are showing to be to have strong statements and to have a strong will to continue the struggle. And from the outside, I think that we are looking at something positive. And the international support from Iran to Syria, etc., I think that will be positive. I think it has been a positive step, after which I hope other positive steps will take place. And that this weakens Israel gradually. Israel has made mistakes in its war against Syria. And now it is finding problems also with Palestine. Thank you very much, Iñaki and Jorge, for your time talking about their ideas on such an important topic. It is clear that a good part of questions will be clear once the First Minister Netanyahu appoints the successor of Lieberman after this controversial resignation. And there we will see if there would be advanced elections or not before November 2019. It's important to know what interests and roles do the mediators play, but this unwritten truce has Egypt as an important mediator, and the United Nations until now have been unable to find a solution to this historic conflict. We will ask this to our next guest after the pause. We continue with Critical Move on the resignation of the Minister of Defense of Israel, Lieberman, and all the political effects this decision has had. Let's go to the essence and ultimate move of Hamas. The armed branch of Palestinian resistance Hamas was founded in 1987 with the first intifada by Alded Abdassid Yandidsi, and with a party with a nationalistic combat. It has been called a terrorist organization by United States and Europe. Nevertheless, Palestine inside the group is admired by the forces of resistance of Palestinians there against Israel's war aggressions. This is why in 2006 Hamas attained 176 of the 172 Legislative Assembly. Hamas is translated in emotion and is consistent with Islamic resistance. It has associations with the organization founded by Yasser Arafat, the PLO, since 1967. The Gaza Strip is Hamas's action land, but they agreed to assign the power to Palestinian Authority. This transparency of power is in a pause because of the conservation of weapons by Hamas on land. And the proposal establishes Palestinian state in Cisjordan and the Gaza Strip. Even the acknowledgement, regarding the acknowledgement of the State of Israel, Hamas refuses to do that. Bassem Taheldine is here with us to analyze. First, I ask a factor of distraction by the media, or is there an important turn in the forums? Israel has always sought or tried to eliminate, as they say, the possibility of life conditions of the Palestinian people, of expelling the Palestinian people. Nevertheless, the foundational logic of Israel, this is not convenient because it is there in that essential site of Middle East. It perpetuates war and serves the interest of the military-industrial complex. How could Israel make peace with Palestine and allow life in a continuous state in these ghettos that are separated, a continuous state with possibilities of having a normal life in Palestine and making peace with other countries of the Middle East, Syria, Egypt, Lebanon? No, this is not convenient to the militaristic, expansive, destructive logic of Israel, but neither to the needs and interests that are behind these. All of them are profiting from the situation that the Palestinian people are paying. But there's also a reality, an international community that is looking what is happening in Palestine. Numberless massacres have taken place in the last months and years, especially in the last months with the March of Return. Public, notorious massacres where Israeli soldiers, like a sport, 21st century, we still talk about settlers who rob land to originary people and exercise their sport that for them is something very highly advertised in the media. They even make posters, logos, and they get ready to kill Palestinian people in the border. In the last months, more than 300 Palestinians have died, with 2,000 people wounded. And this last action, shooting their legs or their faces. And I repeat, this has been some kind of perverse game that hasn't motivated this international reaction that has not been the most appropriate regarding condemning. But these condemnations, even legitimate, the criminal action of an ideology that is in the Middle East that makes game with other perverse ideologies, Zionism and Wahhabism. There are twin souls. Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the neocons in the United States, European fascism, twin souls that are there for in the name of religion, in this case of the Judaism or Islamic fundamentalists with a false Islam that are trying to struggle for an alleged God or a promised land, things that are good for publicity and the stupid people who believe this in the world. But ultimately conceal the militaristic war interests that are making billions of dollars, because these weapons are consumed by Israel in a perpetual war. But this last intervention has put them in a bad spot. A weapons supplier was it seems that these Patriot missiles are not very good. These are house-made, and they used to attempt to return the damage. Well, they can never damage a power. Nevertheless, resistance and resilience is imposed, and they are very well placed before the world, because it's a David against Goliath that tries to murder, destroy, and today reproduce something we believe is extinct, an ideology similar to the Nazi ideology, which they suffered, and now they are imposing against a defenseless people. In the last section, we said that people of the Gaza Strip and Hamas deemed that Lieberman's resignation is a victory of Palestinian resistance and admission of the failure of this man, who appears as the great killer of Gaza. Everything that happens inside the Zionist entity of Israel, all the contradictions, are considered political victories, especially in the middle of this cruel situation that the Palestinian people is undergoing. This action was no other thing than a escalade of aggressions against Palestine that murdered one of the leaders of Hamas, of the high commanders, not political, fighting commanders. But Palestinian resistance returned a coup and also hit with its missiles military infrastructure, a military bus with Israeli soldiers were transported. But they don't say the amounts of people. But some news appear that are inconsistent with realities. Nevertheless, they hit high Zionist commands in that region. Lieberman is making a move that pretends to become him the future first minister, pressed for to have advanced elections, dismiss Netanyahu, which I think will not be possible because this criminal war, both are criminal war, Zionists, an emulation of the current of Nazism, but that perhaps Lieberman's projection is to use the situation to become first minister and carry out all the policies we have been describing throughout this program. Israel will not stop with Palestine. For them, for the defenseless people and all the peoples of humanity that are truly humane, it would be expelling a people, permanent genocide of a people, and they will not stop with that, because they want to take this war and destruction by arming terrorist groups, and all the weapons confiscated are Israeli, and the action against the Yemeni people, etc. So Israel's real action is to create chaos on the region. For the military-industrial complex, Zionists have important investments in the United States and Europe at the expense of a defenseless people and another people, such as the Jewish people, Israelis today, many of which have been dissociated and used. Many of them have been captured, both inside and outside Israel, Jewish that oppose that systematic policy. Now, I ask you in political terms, could elections be advanced? Or let's go to a question that would clarify more. What do they need to advance elections? By parliament, but they don't have the possibility because they still have majority. Very close, but perhaps with some distortions we can achieve that. But more than anticipated devolutions, this is the fourth, but he has been minister in another administration, so he hasn't left the government. He has had important positions in government for many years. Perhaps the time has come. And these are speculations made by other analysis. Perhaps if he would use this to leave the package because he's exhausted his political life. And in this case, a much more radical wing led by Neumann projects as one of the most genocide and criminal groups that have existed in Israel. And we have a dissociated population. More than 70% would support the possibility of Lieberman conducting the most criminal policy. The hostile speech of Hitler in the 40s led to an important part of the German population to support the genocide policy. Today in Europe and here in Brazil, there is a xenophobous, racist speech that uses a defenseless people, refugee, people that resist being expelled from their own land, and the shield of religion to justify these crimes. Churches supporting mosques, synagogues, putting people to struggle for what they believe, to truly cover the real interests that we have seen before. A system that uses war, perhaps to remake the world political puzzle, in this case in the Middle East, because we all know that Israel is now other thing but an extension of the United States in that region. They call it the armed branch of the United States. Now, in the critical situation, UN Special Envoy Nicolai Gladeno called Egypt to calm down Egypt. What would be most convenient for this neighbor? Peace would be this neighbor's first reality, because the reality of Palestinian resistance and fundamentalist groups with military front command has to inside Egypt itself to a very delicate situation. They have depended to create in Egypt or reproduce. About Syria, what Syria is confronting, although most of these terrorist groups of Al-Qaeda and Daesh have been annihilated, but reproduce Egypt and more. But armed forces are much more compelled in what Israel interests with a strong links to Saudi Arabia. Perhaps this uncertainty and game of internal contradictions perhaps benefit both actors, but mainly Israel. As usual, we're not talking about the Egypt of Nasser. We're talking about Egypt of the contradictions, of the treasure that has an explosive internal and dependent that can't be solved, but that in this case would seek to try to be on the margins. But there they are on the margins, where Israel uses to destabilize himself. Israel has no allies, has no friends, has enemies in the region, and useful pieces he uses to put them to struggle against all. And what could be the most convenient in the United States? Sell weapons. Sell weapons and try to reconstruct a political weapon tree that has left.
Una Siria que logró derrotar a los grupos terroristas apoyados por Arabia Saudita e Israel y también la Unión
All these relations between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Israel is inconvenient to the United States. The United States is interested in changing the political map. Tunisia or Libya, this last country has not been fully controlled, but it continues producing control, and U.S. and European oil companies still benefit. What Michel Colon said, the policy of constructive chaos to allow to expel other stakeholders in the region, like China and Russia, that have consolidated with governments that have been strengthened in the specific case of Syria and Iraq. And Iran also, but in this case, these two Arab countries that have confronted this chaos that induced by Israel and Saudi Arabia, a faithful ally in the region. Thank you very much, Bassem, for your time. We now go to our conclusions.